Chapter 17. The Invisible Boy. Adam and Lake settled into the first empty compartment they saw on the large, long-distance passenger train. The engines began to roar, and the locomotive slowly started rolling. After about 15 minutes, the two finally started to relax. But they did so prematurely because just as they thought they were in the clear, a man and his companion, holding their luggage in one hand and some fancy bright pink drinks with tiny straws and little umbrellas sticking out of them in the other, slid the door of the compartment open. The man stopped and stared at the children for a long moment. Then he set down his bag and grabbed some papers that were sticking out of his sports coat's breast pocket. After looking at his tickets, he once again looked up at Adam and Lake before he leaned back and rechecked the number on the door. While still looking at the number, the gentleman began to speak in a very thick English accent. "I'm terribly sorry, but I believe you are in our cabin." Adam had repeatedly mentally rehearsed what he would say and do if someone walked in on them. He was already getting up, not wanting to make a scene. He grabbed Lake's hand and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, our mistake." Then they quickly squeezed past the couple and back out into the corridor. The man watched the two of them walk away before picking up his bag and entering the room. After another 10 minutes of looking in dozens of occupied compartments, they were almost to the very back of the packed locomotive. Finally, they opened a door and looked inside. At first glance, the cabin appeared to be empty. They both exhaled in relief and stepped a couple of feet into the small room. However, after the two turned to close the door behind them and spun back around, they noticed a boy they hadn't noticed before. He looked slightly older than Adam, and he was sitting in the corner of the cabin. Startled, Adam jumped and blurted, "I'm sorry, I didn't see you there." Adam looked at Lake, more or less for the show of it, but also to silently ask, "Did you see him?" But out loud said, "Silly us, we must have walked into the wrong compartment. They all look alike." But then something strange happened. The boy looked even more startled than Adam. Before Adam and Lake had a chance to retreat, he asked, "Can you see me?" Adam and Lake hesitated, not knowing how to respond to that. It would have been a ridiculous question, but truthfully, they actually didn't see him at first, and he did seem to have appeared out of thin air. "Of course we can," Lake finally blurted out. The boy told the siblings that they were welcome to stay if they wanted to. Adam asked, "I don't think your parents would be okay with that. When they get back, we'll just be in the way." Without hesitation, the boy said, "It's just me. I'm traveling alone." Adam wasn't sure he should trust anyone, but he did not see many other options. Actually, he was relieved, because he feared they might not find an unoccupied cabin at all. After some more thought, Adam relented and told the strange boy, "That would be great, thanks." Adam reached out his hand and said, "I'm Adam, and this is my sister, Lake." The boy shook Adam's hand, nodded at Lake, and said, "My name is Jack Griffin." Although Jack was 13 years old, he was much shorter than Adam. He had dark brown skin and very short black hair. Strangely, his hair, even though it was very short, was still quite unkempt. He was dressed in faded blue jeans and a plain blue jacket. He was wearing old tennis shoes. The left shoe had a large hole in it, revealing his dirty sock, which also had a hole in it, partially revealing the boy's big toe. They all took their seats and were quiet for a couple of minutes, until Lake couldn't take it any longer, and finally asked what both Adam and she had been wondering since they got there. "How come you seem surprised that we could see you?" At first, Jack just smiled, and he said, You don't really want to know, do you? Lake and Adam both adamantly nodded that they did. Then Jack flatly announced without shame or embarrassment, "Because I'm invisible." He said it as if it was a totally normal thing to say. Lake again couldn't help herself and yelled out, "You're what now?" Then she paused, lowered her voice, readjusted her tone, and asked her question again. "I mean to say, what do you mean you're invisible?" Jack seemed very happy that people were taking enough interest in him to ask questions. He opened up as if he were talking to the child psychologist he once used to visit when his parents were going through their divorce. And for the next hour, Jack poured his heart out, telling his story. He began by giving some information about how old he was, where he was from, and whatnot. But then he confided, "You see, most people don't notice me, so after a while, I came to realize that it was because I'm invisible." Adam and Lake took a peek at each other. This was all quite unbelievable, but the two assumed that it was because Jack had had a difficult childhood. Jack continued, "I first started to notice my powers way back at the age of 5. At that time, my parents never paid much attention to me. They were too busy fighting with each other. I naturally just assumed that they were going through a rough patch, and it would eventually turn around, and they would pay attention to me again. But then, when I was 7, my mom and dad split up and eventually got a divorce a year later. I thought it was understandable that my mom didn't see me at that time because she was so angry and grief-stricken. She would eventually come around, I thought. Then she met someone new, and they began to date. Well, she was falling in love, so, of course, the new guy was who she focused on. When I was 10, they got married. Nowadays, my mom still doesn't pay too much attention to me. To be fair, it's because she has been trying her hardest to make her second marriage work. He doesn't make it easy on her, and he doesn't treat her very well either. I don't think my stepdad knows I exist. He couldn't care less about me. And he has never tried to ask me how my day was or get to know me." This was all really heavy stuff, and the Worthies couldn't even imagine what that must have been like for Jack. Both Adam and Lake had always been showered with love. Somehow, their parents always found time for them, even when they were both working multiple jobs. The more Jack talked about his neglected life, the more the siblings started to miss their parents. Lake leaned her head on her brother's shoulder, thankful that she at least still had Adam, and they were together. Jack continued, "So, when I was 12 years old, our school had a big competition. There was going to be a 2-mile race. You see, there was a famous Olympic track athlete from our city. He had just won a gold medal in the Summer Olympics. Anyway, the winner of the race was going to meet him and have dinner with him, and the local newspaper was going to be there to take pictures and write up an article. I don't care much for sports, but I have always been fast. I wanted to win this competition because I thought if I were able to win, I would finally be important enough that people would start noticing me, and my mom and dad would be proud of me, and they would have to pay attention to me. For about 2 months, I trained very hard for the event, and on the day of the race, I was ready. I ran the race, and I came in first place. I was so happy and proud of myself, but that feeling only lasted for exactly 5 seconds, because that was the amount of time I had beaten David Stevens, the kid who came in second." Jack wrinkled up his face and said the name once more with disdain. "David Stevens. He came in second. I beat him, but when he finished, the crowd praised him like they all should have praised me. The school chose David to meet the Olympic star. He had dinner at a fancy restaurant, and the paper wrote an article about him and published his photos with the famous athlete. It was as if I didn't matter or as if I didn't even exist. But then it dawned on me that it wasn't because I didn't matter. It was because they couldn't see me. At that moment, I realized I must be invisible. Adam gave Lake another look. He wasn't so sure that sitting in this compartment was a good idea after all.